At my granddaughter's 18th birthday, I gave her a leather photo album I'd been keeping for her since the day she was born. She glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds before her mother snatched it from her hands and laughed. "Oh dear, Grandma, we asked for the Cartier, not whatever this is." My son didn't even look up from his phone. My granddaughter rolled her eyes and slid the album to the edge of the table, where it tipped and fell into a silver champagne bucket. The ice cracked around it. Her mother said, "Maybe you should have just stayed home, Mom. We told you this wasn't really your kind of room." I didn't say a word. I reached into the bucket, pulled out the album, water sluicing off the leather, and walked out of the Granite Club through 80 staring guests. The next morning, I drove to the TD branch on Bay Street with the album and a folder I'd kept in a fireproof box for 46 years. The young woman at the wealth management desk took one look at the document on top, then at me, and her face went the color of cold porridge. She said, "Mrs. Messes, Hollings, please don't go anywhere. I need to ring our regional director right now." "Hi there. Quick thing before I keep going. Have you ever been talked about like you weren't even in the room? By your own family, no less? Drop a word in the comments." I read every single one, and lately I read them at the kitchen table with my tea. Hit subscribe if you'd like more stories like this one. A few details have been changed to protect people who don't deserve protecting, but the bones of it are real. Now, back to that branch on Bay Street. The Granite Club sits up on Bayview Avenue in Toronto, and I've been there exactly twice in my life. Once for a charity luncheon in the late 90s, and once the night before for my granddaughter's 18th. My son had booked the Wedgwood room. There were ice sculptures, shaped like the number 18, a string quartet playing Taylor Swift arrangements, and a photographer, my daughter-in-law, had flown in from Montreal. I wore the navy dress I'd had since my husband's retirement party in 2008. My daughter-in-law had looked at it when I came in, smiled the way a person smiles when they smell something off, and said, "Oh, Mom, cute." She has called me Mom since the day she married my son, even though her own mother is alive and well in Oakville. I don't know why. I never asked. The album was wrapped in brown craft paper because that's how I always wrap things. I tied it with a length of hemp twine I had left over from the garden. Inside the album were photographs. Every photograph I had of my granddaughter from the moment her mother brought her home from Mount Sinai 18 years ago. Her first night in the bassinet. Her at the cottage on Lake of Bays, 3 years old, holding a smallmouth bass nearly as long as her arm. Her at 6, dressed as a Mountie for Halloween, scowling. Her on the front porch of the house I'd raised her father in, the morning of her first day of grade 9. There were 84 photographs, and on the inside cover, in my own handwriting, I had written the address of an apartment on Avenue Road and a sentence that said, "For when you're ready to know what your grandmother actually built." She didn't open it long enough to see any of that. I should tell you about my son. He's a partner at one of the big 7 law firms downtown, the kind that occupies 4 floors of a tower on King Street and sends Christmas hampers from Holt Renfrew. He is 42 years old. When he was 8, he had a stutter so bad he couldn't say his own name in class, and I sat on the edge of his bed every night for 2 years and read him Owl Moon until the words came back to him. When he was 17, he got into U of T law track on a scholarship, and the morning the letter came, he picked me up off the kitchen floor in a hug, so hard my back cracked. I don't recognize the man he is now. I don't know when the change happened. I think it was somewhere between his second promotion and the move to Forest Hill, but I couldn't pin it to a date if you paid me. His wife is a vice president at one of the banks. Not my bank, a different one. She drives a Range Rover she calls the truck, sends my granddaughter to a private school in Rosedale, and 3 Christmases ago she returned the cashmere scarf I bought her at Holt's because, and I'm quoting, "the color was a bit Marks and Spencer." That was the moment I should have understood what was coming. I didn't. I was 68 then, and I still thought love did the heavy lifting in families. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about a lot of things. My granddaughter, and oh, this is the part that hurts. She used to come to my house on Beechwood Avenue every Saturday morning when she was small. We'd make pancakes shaped like the letters of her name. We'd walk down to the ravine and she'd fill her pockets with maple keys and acorns, and one time a dead bumblebee she insisted we bury under the lilac bush. I have 1,000 of those Saturdays in my memory, and somewhere around when she turned 14, they stopped. Her mother had her doing competitive equestrian on weekends, then debate club, then Model UN, then the trips to Whistler and Mont Tremblant and the cottage in Muskoka her parents bought, the one I've never been invited to. I didn't push. Teenagers are teenagers. I kept making her birthday cards. I kept buying her presents, and I kept the album going, year by year, photograph by photograph, because I believed, God help me, I believed that one day she'd open it and understand who I was. The night of the party, I arrived at the Granite Club at 6:30. My son didn't get up from the head table to greet me. My daughter-in-law air-kissed somewhere near my left ear and said, "Mom, sit at the back table. We've put you with my Aunt Phyllis." Aunt Phyllis is 86, mostly deaf, and was already 3 glasses into the Chardonnay. I sat. I ate the salmon. I watched the toasts. My son stood up and said his daughter was the brightest light of his and her mother's lives, and didn't mention me. Not once. There were aunts and cousins from his wife's side I'd never met. There were friends of my granddaughter's whose parents I knew from the school newsletter. None of them knew who I was. A woman at the next table leaned over and asked if I was on the catering staff. I said no. I was the grandmother. She said, "Oh, how nice that they invited you." The gifts came at 9. My granddaughter sat at a low table they'd set up like a stage, and one by one, the guests brought their boxes forward. There was a Cartier necklace, a love bracelet actually, in rose gold from her parents. There was a Louis Vuitton overnight bag from a friend's family. There was a check for $10,000 from a great uncle I'd never seen before in my life. Then I came up. I had to walk the length of the room. My knees aren't what they were. I set the package on the table, and my granddaughter looked at it the way you look at a tax form. She picked at the twine. She got it open. The album sat there in its brown leather, and she said, "And I will remember this until the day they put me in the ground," she said. "Oh, old photos?" I asked for the Cartier. Her mother laughed, a real laugh, throat back, teeth out. She reached over, took the album from my granddaughter's hands, flipped it open to a random page, and held it up so the table behind her could see. "Oh, look, Mom's brought us a craft project. Are these from the 80s? They look like the 80s. My son, my own son, finally looked up from his phone. He glanced at the album, glanced at me, and said, "Mom, we'll deal with this later. You can take it home." Then he turned back to his phone. My granddaughter pushed the album away with one finger, like she was sliding a plate she didn't want. It hit the silver champagne bucket on the corner of the table, tipped, and went in. Ice and water and Veuve Clicquot. Her mother said, "Oh, Mom, honestly, maybe you should have just stayed home. We told you this wasn't really your kind of room." I stood up. I walked to the table. I reached into the bucket. The water was so cold it made my wrist ache, and I pulled the album out. I didn't shake it off. I didn't say anything. I held it against my chest, and I walked through the Wedgwood room of the Granite Club with 80 guests staring, and the string quartet playing some sad pretty thing I didn't recognize, and my pumps clicking on the parquet. And I went out into the November night, and I drove myself home to Beechwood Avenue, and I sat on the kitchen floor with the wet album on my lap, and I did not cry. I had not cried in front of anyone in 41 years, and I was not going to start in an empty kitchen at 71. I laid the album out on tea towels. I put a fan on it. I made a pot of red rose. I sat at the table and I thought about what I was going to do. What none of them knew, what I had never once told my son in his entire life, was that the apartment on Avenue Road I'd written into the inside cover of that album was real. So was the building it was in. So were the 11 other buildings. My husband died of a heart attack in 1979. My son was 14 months old. I was 26. I had a teaching certificate from Lakehead and $30,000 in a savings account and a mother-in-law in Sudbury who told me on the phone the night of the funeral that I should think about coming home. I didn't. I got a job at a primary school in East York, and I rented a basement in Riverdale, and I raised my boy on a teacher's salary and Friday night spaghetti. In 1983, my husband's life insurance paid out $48,000. Everyone, and I mean everyone, including my own father, told me to put it in a GIC. I didn't. I bought a triplex on Coxwell Avenue for $42,000. The roof leaked. The basement flooded twice that first winter. I learned to patch shingles from a library book. I learned wiring from a Filipino electrician named Bayani who lived next door and charged me in lasagna. I rented 2 of the 3 units to other young widows from the church, and I lived in the 3rd with my son. The rent paid the mortgage. After 3 years, I had enough for the down payment on a 4-plex on Pape. After that, a 6-plex on the Danforth. I never told my son. I let him grow up believing we were poor because we lived like we were, and because I wanted him to learn that money is the thing you build with, not the thing you wear. By 2003, I had 8 buildings. By 2015, 12. 71 units, mostly to working tenants, nurses, transit drivers, single mothers, a few graduate students. I kept the rents below market. I never sold. I incorporated under a numbered Ontario company so my name wouldn't appear on the deeds, and I hired a good young property manager named Alexi who treated my tenants like family. I drove the same 2009 Toyota Corolla. I clipped coupons. I bought my groceries at no frills. I lived in the same brick semi on Beechwood I bought in 1991 for $158, and which Zillow now tells me is worth $1.6. The total portfolio, last I looked, comes in around 28 million Canadian. The apartment I'd written in the inside cover of the album, a 2-bedroom in a building I owned just south of Lawrence, was the one I had set aside for my granddaughter. Title in her name on her 25th birthday, plus a separate trust at TD that her father didn't know existed. $3.1 million, accruing interest since the day she was born. That was what she'd thrown into the champagne bucket. But that wasn't even the part that came back to me first, sitting at the kitchen table that night. The part that came back to me first was something I'd been turning over for about 6 weeks and trying not to think about. 3 weeks before the party, a letter had been delivered to my house. The old house on Beechwood, addressed to my son at his old childhood address, where I still got his mail occasionally because he hadn't bothered to update 20 years of subscriptions. It was from a compliance officer at his firm, marked confidential. I had stared at it on the hall table for 2 days before I called my old friend Constable Hamish Duggal, retired now from Toronto Police, lives up in Bracebridge, my husband's best man. I read him the return address. He went quiet for a long moment. He said, "Open it." I told him I couldn't. He said, "Open it. If it's nothing, you'll feel silly. If it's something, you'll need to know." I steamed the seal. I read it. I sat on the bottom step of my staircase for about 40 minutes after. The letter said the firm was conducting an internal review of trust account discrepancies relating to my son's practice group. Approximately $410,000 had been moved through client trust accounts to a numbered company in the British Virgin Islands over the course of 14 months. The letter requested he attend an interview with the firm's general counsel. There was a date. There was a date that had already passed. I had called Hamish back. He said, "Get a forensic accountant today." He gave me a name. A woman named Rina Beauchamp in Ottawa, retired from the RCMP, who took private clients on the quiet. I drove to Ottawa the next morning. I gave her the letter and 3 years of bank statements I had no business having, but which my son had once asked me to keep in my safe, in case of fire. I told her to find out everything. She called me back 6 days later. She said, "Mrs. Hollings, your son has been moving money out of clients' real estate trust accounts for 16 months. The numbered company in the BVI is registered to his wife's maiden name. There are now 5 clients who have flagged irregularities. The firm is going to dismiss him within the month. The Law Society is going to disbar him within the year. And the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit is almost certainly going to lay charges. I would estimate 12 to 18 months for that." I asked her if my granddaughter knew. She said, "There is no evidence anywhere that your granddaughter knows. None. She's clean." So is everyone else, except your son, and likely your daughter-in-law, although the evidence on her is thinner. So I had known, sitting at that table watching them laugh at me. I had known the whole time. I had walked in with the album and the apartment deed and $3.1 million in my hand for my granddaughter's future. And I had also known, behind my ribs, that the man my granddaughter called Dad was going to be in handcuffs by Easter, and the woman my granddaughter called Mom was going to be a witness for the Crown. I had brought the album because I'd thought, even then, even knowing that maybe at some point in the evening I'd find a moment to take my granddaughter aside, to say, open this carefully. Look at the inside cover. Whatever happens in the next few months, you have somewhere to go and someone to come to. I didn't get the moment. They didn't give me the moment. They threw the moment in the champagne bucket. So that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the wet album drying on a tea towel, I made a decision. I was not going to tell my son. I was not going to warn my daughter-in-law. I was going to let it happen the way it was going to happen, and I was going to be the place my granddaughter landed when it did. The next morning was a Monday. I drove down to the TD branch on Bay Street, where I'd kept the family accounts since 1981. I asked for the wealth management desk. A young woman with a badge that said Margot, senior advisor, greeted me. I gave her the album, still slightly damp at the spine, and the folder I'd brought from home. The folder contained the deed to the apartment on Avenue Road, the trust documentation for my granddaughter, and a letter I'd written that morning at 4 a.m. in my own hand. Margot opened the folder. She looked at the deed. She looked at me. She said, "I'll be just a moment, Mrs. Hollings." She came back with a man named Jill Tremblay, who was the regional director of private wealth and who had personally managed my account since 2011. He took me into a quiet room at the back. He poured me a coffee. He said, "Penelope, what's going on?" And I told him the whole thing, the party, the album, the letter, the forensic accountant's report, the $410,000 in the BBI. I told him I needed two things. I needed to update my granddaughter's trust to take effect immediately on her father's arrest, not on her 25th birthday. And I needed the name of a very good lawyer who specialized in trust litigation, but who would also know, if it came to that, how to keep an 18-year-old girl out of a forensic interview she didn't deserve to be in. Gilles wrote down a name on a card. He said, "She's expensive. She's worth it." Her name was Marisol Aitken-Pell, downtown firm, 28 years at the bar. I called her from my car. I drove to her office that afternoon. By Friday, the trust had been updated and a separate emergency fund had been parked in an account in my granddaughter's name with my signature as the sole co-trustee. By the following Monday, Marisol had drafted a letter ready to be sent the moment my son was charged that would offer my granddaughter the apartment and a place at my kitchen table any day she wanted it. And then I waited. 2 weeks passed. 3, 4. My son didn't call. My daughter-in-law didn't call. My granddaughter didn't call. I went to church on Sundays at St. Aidan's. I had Saturday tea with my friend Bonnie at the Tim's on Mount Pleasant. I went to the gym on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a seniors aquafit class at the North Toronto Memorial Pool. I lived my life. I waited. On the 7th of December, a Tuesday, snowing, my phone rang at 9:14 in the morning. It was my son. The first thing he said before hello was, "Mum, I need you to wire me $200,000. Today, I'll explain later." I sat down. I asked him what was wrong. He said, "Mum, please, I'll pay it back. I just need it today." I asked him again what was wrong. He said, "There's a misunderstanding at the firm. I just need to make something right before it gets bigger." I asked him if he had spoken to a lawyer. He said, "I don't need a lawyer." He said, "I don't need a lawyer. I need $200,000. I said, "I don't have $200,000 to give you, son," which was true and not true. He hung up on me. He called back 4 hours later. He was crying. I had not heard him cry since the funeral. He said, Mum, I'm in trouble." I said, "I know you are. I'm known for 2 months. Get a lawyer." Marisol Aitkenpel. Tell her your mother sent you. She won't take your case, but she'll tell you who to call." There was a long, long silence. He said, "How do you know that name?" I said. "I'll see you when I see you, son. I love you. I've loved you every day of your life. You are not a child anymore, and I am not going to fix this for you." I hung up. 20 minutes later, my granddaughter called. She was crying so hard I couldn't understand the first sentence. I made her stop. I made her breathe. She said, "Grandma, the police were just at our house. They took Dad's computer. They took Mom's computer. They took Mom's computer. They took my laptop. They asked me about a company in the British Virgin Islands. I don't know anything about a company in the British Virgin Islands." "Grandma, what is going on?" I said. "Sweetheart, where are you right now?" She said, "I'm in the car. I drove. I don't know where I'm going." I said, "Drive to my house. Drive to Beechwood. Don't stop. Don't call your mother. Don't call your father. Come to me." She arrived at my front door 40 minutes later in tears, in a North Face coat over pajama pants, no makeup, 18 years old and looking 8. I made her tea. I made her sit at my kitchen table, the same table where her father had eaten his Friday night spaghetti for 18 years, and I told her the truth, all of it. The letter from the firm, the forensic accountant, the British Virgin Islands, the party, the album. I went and got the album, dried now, slightly warped at the edges but readable, and I opened it to the inside cover and I showed her the address on Avenue Road and the sentence I had written. She read it. She read it. She read it twice. She looked up at me. She said, "Grandma, I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't, sweetheart." She said, "I am so sorry about the party." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone about all of this?" And I said, "Because I wanted to know who you were going to be without it. And I'm sorry to say, sweetheart, you weren't quite the person I'd hoped. But you've got time. You've got more time than your father had because he didn't have anyone telling him these things at 18. I'm telling you now." She put her head down on my kitchen table and she cried. I let her. I made another pot of tea. After a while, she sat up and she said, "What do I do now?" I said, "First, we eat dinner. Then you sleep in your father's old bedroom. Tomorrow, we call Marisol Aitkenpel. Then we go visit your father at whatever lockup they've got him in. Then we figure the rest out one Tuesday at a time." She stayed that night. She stayed the next night. She stayed for 10 months. My son was charged in February with fraud over $5,000 and breach of trust under the criminal code. He took a plea in April, 46 months federal time, served at Beaver Creek up in Gravenhurst. My daughter-in-law was named in the prosecution, but turned Crown's witness, and she got a suspended sentence and a permanent ban from working in financial services. They lost the house in Forest Hill. They lost the cottage. They lost the Range Rover. My daughter-in-law moved back to Oakville with her own mother, and the last I heard, she was working at a Williams Coffee pub. My granddaughter took the year off before university. She lived with me on Beechwood. She came with me on Tuesdays to inspect properties. She met Alexi, my property manager, and she liked him. She started learning the books from him. She started visiting tenants with me on Saturday mornings. There's an elderly Jamaican couple in one of my Pate buildings, the Bucaws, who have been with me since 1996, and the first time my granddaughter sat in their kitchen drinking ginger tea and listening to Mrs. Benia Bucaw tell stories about Kingston in the 60s, she came home and said to me, "Grandma, I never knew people lived like this. I mean, talked like this, listened like this." She started at McGill the following September, and she's there now, second year, doing a joint degree in social work and economics. She comes home most weekends. She visits her father in Gravenhurst once a month. She has not seen her mother since the spring. The apartment on Avenue Road is hers. I signed it over on her 19th birthday. She's renting it out to a young couple who just had a baby at well below market, and she's banking the rest in a savings account I helped her open. The trust is hers. She hasn't touched it. She says she wants to earn things the way I did. I told her she doesn't have to. She told me she wants to. We're working on it. The album sits on the bookshelf in my front room. It's still a little warped. There's a champagne stain on the edge of the leather, like a tide line. I leave it there because I want her to see it every time she comes home, not as a punishment, as a record of the night that nothing was the same after, a record of the night her grandmother walked out of the Granite Club with her dignity in her 2 hands and went home and decided what came next. I'm 72 now. I still drive the Corolla, I still live on Beechwood, I still go to Saturday tea with Bonnie. Alexi and I are starting a foundation in the spring, a small one, 10 units to start, transitional housing for women leaving abusive marriages, the way I would have needed if my husband hadn't been the man he was. My granddaughter is on the board, and here's the thing I want to say to you, friend, before you go. I'm a believer. I have been my whole life, and I think the Lord gives us our hardest tests not to break us, but to show us what we're made of. He showed me that night at the Granite Club that I had built a life that did not need their approval to mean something. He showed my granddaughter 6 weeks later in my kitchen that there was somewhere to land. He's still working on my son. That part isn't finished, but I trust the Lord with what isn't finished. Don't do what I did. Don't let your pride keep you silent for 40 years. I should have told my son about the buildings when he turned 18, the way I'm telling my granddaughter now. I should have told him, you can do hard things, son, because your mother did and you came from her. I didn't. I let him think we were small, and somewhere in there he came to believe small was something to be ashamed of, and a wife came along who agreed with him, and the rest you know. So tell the people you love who you really are. Don't wait for them to throw your gift in a fountain to find out. If you've made it this far, thank you. I mean that. Tell me in the comments. Has anyone in your family ever underestimated you because of how you live, what you wear, what you drive? I read everyone. Subscribe if you'd like to come back for another Saturday tea. Some details have been changed to protect people who don't deserve protecting, but the bones of it are real. God bless you. And remember, it was never just old photos. I've been turning that night over in my head for nearly 2 years now, and I keep coming back to the same quiet truth. Nothing that happened in the Wedgwood room came out of nowhere. My son didn't wake up one morning and decide to move $410,000 through a numbered company in the Caribbean. My daughter-in-law didn't wake up one morning and decide her mother-in-law wasn't worth a chair near the front. My granddaughter didn't wake up one morning and decide an album of her own childhood was something to push aside. These were the slow accumulations of 100 small choices made in front of one another, ratified by silence. Mine included. I taught at a primary school for 31 years, and one thing I learned about children and about the adults they grow into is that they become whatever you keep agreeing to. I agreed to too much. When my son rolled his eyes at the Corolla in his 20s, I laughed it off. When my daughter-in-law returned the Holt scarf, I told myself it was a generational thing. When my granddaughter stopped coming round on Saturdays, I told myself she was busy. Every time I shrugged, I was teaching them what they could get away with. And cause meets effect. The way a creek meets a river. Slow at first, and then all at once at the Granite Club in front of 80 witnesses. What I want to say to you, friend, if you're sitting somewhere with a cup of tea and a quiet ache in your chest, is that there is a kind of strength that has nothing to do with shouting and nothing to do with cutting people off. It's the strength of knowing what you've actually built. In your bank account, yes, but more importantly in your character, and refusing to let anybody talk you out of believing it's real. I walked out of the Wedgwood room with a wet album under my arm because I had spent 46 years building a person who could walk out. The buildings on Coxwell and Pape were the easy part. The harder part was learning to patch a roof from a library book at 27 and learning at 71 to let my own son fall when he needed to fall. What I'd ask you to take from this, not as a lesson, because I'm not in the lesson business, but as a thought to sit with, is that decency is something you practice on the small days. Be honest with the people you love about who you are before life forces the conversation. Teach the children in your life that work has dignity. Even the work that nobody sees. And when somebody you love does something cruel, don't rush to forgive and don't rush to retaliate. Just be still. Let the consequences arrive on their own schedule. They always do. My granddaughter is at McGill now, doing the joint degree, and she is becoming someone I genuinely like. That didn't happen because I lectured her. It happened because the world taught her, and I happened to have a kitchen table ready when she got home. He was sitting on the front steps of my building when I pulled into the parking lot. That was the first thing I saw. My son, 34 years old, sitting on concrete steps in November with a hockey bag at his feet, and my grandson asleep against his shoulder. I sat in the car for a moment before I got out. Just sat there. I needed that moment. He didn't see me right away. He was staring at the ground, his jaw set the way it gets when he's trying not to fall apart. Liam has always done that. Goes very still and very quiet when something is really wrong. He did it at his father's funeral 12 years ago. He did it when the doctor told us his daughter needed surgery at 3 weeks old. And he was doing it now, on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting outside my building with a hockey bag and his 5-year-old son sleeping on his shoulder. I got out of the car. He looked up, and I watched something cross his face. Relief, shame, exhaustion, all of it at once. "She changed the locks," he said. I didn't say anything. I walked to the trunk and opened it. "Mom, is this everything?" He looked at the bag. "She said she'd send the rest." I picked up the hockey bag. It wasn't heavy. That was the part that stayed with me later, that everything my son had managed to take from his own home fit in one hockey bag that I could carry with one hand. "Wake him up gently," I said. "He can sleep in the guest room." My grandson stirred when Liam shifted him, blinked at me with those dark eyes of his, and said, "Grandma, are we having a sleepover?" "We are," I said. "A good one." He seemed satisfied with that and tucked his face back against his father's neck. Liam carried him upstairs. I carried the bag. Nobody said anything else until my grandson was settled under the quilt in the spare room with the door half closed, and Liam was standing in my kitchen looking like he hadn't eaten since morning. I put the kettle on. "Do you want to tell me what happened, or do you want to eat first?" "I don't know where to start." "Start with today." He pulled out a chair and sat down. "She called me at work, said she'd had the locks changed and I should arrange to collect my things by the end of the week. That was it. That was the whole call. I put a plate in front of him, leftover roast from Sunday, bread, whatever I had, and sat down across from him. How long has this been coming?" He was quiet for a moment. "Months. Maybe longer. I don't know, Mom. I thought we were working through it. We've been talking about seeing someone, a counselor. She seemed like she wanted to fix things. I knew some of this. Not all of it. Liam doesn't call his mother every time his marriage hits a rough patch, and I respect that. But I noticed things over the past year. The way she'd stopped coming to Sunday dinners, the way my grandson sometimes said things that 5-year-olds shouldn't know to say. Small things. Things that sit in the back of a mother's mind. "The house?" I said. "Whose name is on the mortgage?" He looked at me. "Both of ours." "And whose name is on the deed?" He paused. "Both." I nodded slowly. "Then she can't change those locks without your agreement. You understand that?" "I know, but Liam..." I waited until he looked at me properly. "I'm not just telling you this as your mother. I'm telling you this as someone who has spent 30 years working in real estate law. She cannot do what she did today without legal consequences. And you are not going to sit here and tell me you have nowhere to go, because you do. You're already here, but more importantly, you have rights, and so does your son." He was quiet again. He ate a few bites. Outside, the wind had picked up off the lake. I could hear it against the kitchen window. "She said she'd spoken to a lawyer," he said finally, "that everything was already in motion." "What does that mean to you?" "I don't know. It scared me." I understood why. When someone tells you things are already in motion, especially when you're tired and you've just picked up your son from a bench outside a building with a hockey bag, it sounds like it's already over, like the decision has been made without you. That's how it's supposed to sound. That's what it's designed to do. Did she show you anything in writing? I asked. No. Has anyone served you any papers? No. Then nothing is in motion, I said. Someone told her to say that, or she said it on her own to get you to leave quietly. Either way, nothing has happened yet that can't be addressed, but we need to be careful about what you do next. He pushed the plate aside. Mom, I don't want to fight her. I just want to see my son. I know. I refilled his tea, and that is exactly why you cannot leave this to chance. I didn't sleep much that night. That's not unusual for me. I haven't slept through the night in about a decade, but this was a different kind of wakefulness. I lay in the dark and thought about what I knew and what I didn't. I knew the house. I'd been there many times. A semi-detached in Kanata, bought 4 years ago. Both names on the title, as Liam had confirmed. I'd actually reviewed the purchase agreement when they bought it, not as a lawyer formally, just as a mother who happens to know what to look at. I knew there was a child, which changed everything. In Ontario, when there's a child involved, the Family Law Act and the Children's Law Reform Act become central. Custody, access, the child's primary residence, none of that is settled by one person changing a lock on a Tuesday afternoon. None of it. What I didn't know was what she had actually been told, or by whom. I've spoken to a lawyer can mean many things. It can mean she'd had a proper consultation and received real advice. It can also mean she'd talked to a friend of a friend who'd been through divorce, or looked something up online, or spoken to someone at a community legal clinic who gave her general information she'd taken as specific direction. I'd seen it happen many times. People go into these situations with incomplete information and act on it in ways that hurt everyone, including themselves. In the morning, I called my colleague. Not a partner at my firm. I retired from practice 2 years ago, but a woman I'd worked alongside for almost 15 years who now ran her own family law practice out of an office on Elgin Street. We'd referred cases back and forth for years. I trusted her judgment completely. I told her the outline of the situation. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can he come in this week?" "He can come in today if you have anything. I have a cancellation at 2. Bring him." I went and knocked on the guest room door. My grandson was awake and had found the box of old Lego I keep for him in the closet. He had it spread across the floor and was deeply absorbed. "Dad's still sleeping," he told me without looking up. "He made a funny noise." "That's just snoring," I said. "Have you had breakfast?" He had not. I took him to the kitchen, made oatmeal with brown sugar the way he likes it, and by the time Liam appeared in the doorway looking like he'd aged 5 years and a night, there was coffee waiting for him. "You have an appointment at 2 o'clock, I said. He looked at me. "With who?" "A very good family law lawyer. Her name is Catherine. She'll explain everything properly." "Mom, I can't afford—" "One step at a time," I said. "Go shower. We'll talk about everything else after." I didn't go into the appointment with Liam. He's 34, not 14, and Catherine didn't need me in the room. I sat in the waiting area and read a magazine I wasn't actually reading, and when they came out 45 minutes later, Liam looked different. Not better exactly, but less like a man who'd been told the story was already over. Catherine walked him to the door and then looked at me. We'd known each other a long time. She gave me a small nod. On the way back to my building, we'd left my grandson with a neighbor I trusted. Liam was quiet for a while. Then he said, "She told me some things I didn't know." "That's what she's there for." "About the house, about my right to be there?" "Yes. She said that even with both names on the title, there are specific provisions under the Family Law Act about the matrimonial home, that neither of us can exclude the other without a court order." "That's correct." He was quiet again. "She also said I should document everything, every communication, every time I'm denied access to the house or to my son. That's very good advice." He turned to look at me. "Did you know all of this when you said those things last night?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I knew enough to know that what she did yesterday wasn't the end of the road. I didn't want you thinking it was. He was quiet the rest of the way back. But when we got out of the car, he stopped and said, "Thank you, Mom." I didn't say anything to that. Some things don't need a response. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not simple or clean. I want to be honest about that. These situations never are. There were calls that didn't get returned. There was an evening when Liam was supposed to pick up my grandson and arrived to find the door answered by her sister, who said the boy was sick and couldn't go. My grandson was not sick. Liam could hear him in the background asking who was at the door. He texted me from the car. I told him to document it carefully, the time, the date, what was said, what he heard. He did. There were also things I had no control over. My son had to make his own decisions. There were moments when I wanted to pick up the phone myself and say things I would not have said professionally, things that lived in the part of me that is a mother first and a retired lawyer second. I didn't make those calls, but I wanted to. What I could do was stay steady, answer the phone at 11 at night, drive my grandson to school on the days Liam was working and didn't have childcare sorted, help Liam find a furnished room in Westboro through a contact I had, somewhere decent and affordable while everything was being sorted out. And I could make sure the right things were documented and the right people were informed. Catherine filed an application for a temporary parenting order. It was heard in family court in Ottawa 6 weeks after my son sat on those steps outside my building. The judge, a woman about my age, gray-haired and unhurried, looked at the documentation Liam had kept. She looked at the records of the denied pickup. She looked at the letter my son's landlord had provided, confirming he had stable housing. She granted interim shared parenting, alternating weeks, effective immediately. My grandson moved between 2 houses after that. It wasn't easy for him. It isn't easy for any child in that situation, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. But he was not disappearing. He was not being made to vanish from one parent's life by a lock that had no legal right to be changed in the first place. I've thought many times about what would have happened if Liam had not come to my building that night, if he'd gone to a friend's place instead, or sat with it alone for a few days, or believed what he'd been told, that things were already in motion and it was too late to change the direction. I think he might have given up ground that would have been very hard to recover. Not because he wanted to, but because fear and exhaustion will do that to a person. They make you feel like the other side is further ahead than they actually are. I'm not telling this story because everything turned out perfectly. The divorce is still ongoing as I write this. There is still anger and there are still hard days for Liam and for my grandson, and I expect there will be for a while yet. I'm telling it because of the moment in the parking lot when my son looked up and I could see what he was thinking, that he was stranded, that the decision had been made and all he could do was figure out where to sleep. I'm a property lawyer, or I was for 30 years. I have watched a lot of people sign papers they didn't fully understand and walk away from things they had every right to keep. I've also watched people stand their ground in situations where they were told they had none left and come through it. The night my grandson asked if we were having a sleepover, I told him yes. A good one, I meant it. If you're in a situation where you don't know your rights around your home, your children, your property, please don't assume that what someone tells you in a moment of conflict is the whole truth. Find out for yourself. In Ontario, Legal Aid Ontario has resources and referral services. Community legal clinics exist in most cities. A single consultation with a family law lawyer does not commit you to anything. It just gives you accurate information when you need it most. You do not have to figure it out from a front step with a hockey bag. If there is something specific you want me to talk about, property rights for married and common law couples, what the matrimonial home provisions actually mean, what to do in the first 48 hours if something like this happens to someone you love, tell me in the comments. I read them. You don't have to fight this alone. I've been thinking about that parking lot a lot lately. The way Liam looked up when he heard my car door close. The way he didn't ask for anything, didn't say, "Can I stay here or can you help me?" He just said, "She changed the locks," and waited, like he wasn't sure what came next. I think about the choices that led to that moment, not just hers. The locked door, the phone call to his workplace, the casual cruelty of telling someone their home is no longer available to them, but all the smaller choices before that. the conversations that didn't happen, the problems that got set aside because setting them aside was easier than sitting with them. I'm not interested in assigning blame. I watched that marriage from the outside for years, and I know it isn't simple, and I know my son is not without fault in things. That's not what this is about. What I keep coming back to is this. When you act without knowing what you're doing, you don't get the outcome you planned. You get the outcome your actions actually produce. She changed those locks believing, I think, that it would give her control of the situation, that Liam would be off balance, disoriented, without resources, that the story would move in the direction she'd decided. What she didn't account for was that he had somewhere to go, and that where he went happened to be his mother's kitchen, and his mother spent 3 decades in real estate law. That's not luck. That's not the universe rearranging itself on his behalf. That's just cause and effect, playing out the way it always does. Her action produced a reaction she hadn't anticipated because she was working with incomplete information. And I've seen that pattern enough times, in my practice, in my life, to know it repeats itself constantly, in situations big and small. What saved Liam in those weeks wasn't anything dramatic. It was that he kept showing up. He answered Catherine's calls. He kept the documentation she asked him to keep. He found a room in Westboro and he made it work. He drove across the city on days when he had every reason not to, because his son was on the other side of that drive. There were evenings when he called me, and I could hear how worn down he was, and I would say very little, because there was very little to say. You just keep going. You keep doing the next right thing even when you're exhausted, even when it doesn't seem to be moving fast enough, even when someone is making it as hard as they can. That's what I want to say, if anything. Not that things will always work out the way you hoped. I'm too old to promise that. But that steadiness has a value that panic doesn't. That knowing your rights is not aggression, it's preparation. That asking for help is not weakness, it's accuracy. An accurate read of what you need and where to get it. Liam sat on my steps that night with a hockey bag and a sleeping 5-year-old, and he thought it was over. It wasn't over, it was just beginning. And not in the way he feared. Sometimes the moment that looks like the ending is just the moment before you find out what you're actually made of. Noah asked me last week if he could leave some of his Lego at my place permanently. I told him yes. Of course yes. I was pulling the last of the autumn carrots from my garden when my phone rang. It was my neighbor, Ruth, and her voice was wrong from the first syllable. Too quiet, too careful. Eleanor, she said, you need to come to the Riverside Trail. Right now. Don't ask me questions. Just come. I dropped the carrots in the mud and ran. I found my daughter-in-law, Clara, at the edge of the trail near the creek crossing, curled against the base of a birch tree like something the forest had tried to swallow. Her coat was torn at the shoulder. Her left eye was swollen shut. She was holding her ribs with both arms the way you hold something broken that you're afraid will fall apart if you let go. I dropped to my knees in the wet leaves beside her. Clara, look at me. She turned her face slowly. The one eye that could open found mine, and for a moment she just breathed. Then she whispered, your son's mother said I had it coming. She said my family's money was dirty and that Marcus deserved better than someone like me. I felt something go very cold inside my chest. Who did this to you? She closed her eye. She didn't do it herself. She just told Daniel where I walk. Daniel, her brother-in-law. My son, Marcus's younger brother, who I had loved and fed and defended for 61 years of my life. I took her face in my hands as gently as I could. Can you stand? I think so. Then we're going to stand up together, and I'm going to get you somewhere safe, and then I'm going to call my sister. Clara looked at me with that one open eye. What does your sister do? She's a retired Crown attorney, I said, and she has been waiting her whole life for something exactly like this. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand the kind of family I raised my son into before you can understand how any of this happened. Marcus is my eldest. He's 43 years old, a structural engineer, kind in the quiet way that good men often are not showy about it, not needing credit, just steadily, reliably good. He volunteers with Habitat for Humanity on weekends. He calls me every Sunday without fail. He remembers the names of people's dogs. He met Clara 6 years ago at a conference in Ottawa. She was presenting a paper on municipal water infrastructure. He told me afterward that he had understood, for the first time in his adult life, what people meant when they said someone lit up a room. Clara's family is Métis, from a small community outside of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Her grandfather had been a trapper and a guide. Her mother had put herself through nursing school, working double shifts. Clara herself had a master's degree in civil engineering and had spent 3 years working with First Nations communities on clean water access before taking her current position with the city. She was, in every way that mattered, extraordinary. My son's mother, I should be clear, because people always look confused when I say it is not me. Marcus was my husband Gerald's son from his first marriage. Gerald passed 8 years ago, and I had raised Marcus as my own from the time he was 9. His biological mother, Renata, had been largely absent during those years. She'd lived in Vancouver, remarried twice, sent cards at Christmas that arrived in January. When Marcus got serious about Clara, Renata reappeared. I don't know exactly what changed in her. Perhaps she saw in Marcus's happiness something she wanted to claim credit for, or perhaps she simply didn't like that this woman had arrived and filled a space that Renata had never bothered to occupy. What I know is that from the first dinner, before the engagement, before any of it, Renata was cold to Clara in that particular way that leaves no fingerprints. A comment about Clara's earrings being very traditional. A question about her family's background that lingered just a beat too long. A remark at Christmas dinner about how, of course, government infrastructure contracts in certain communities have a different set of, well, standards. Clara had smiled through every single one of them. I had watched her do it and felt a complicated pride and a complicated fury sitting side by side in my chest. Marcus had spoken to Renata twice about it. She had cried both times and said she was only trying to get to know Clara and she didn't understand why everyone was so sensitive. Daniel was Renata's son from her second marriage, 28 years old, living in Calgary, unemployed in the way that has a dozen complicated explanations that all add up to the same thing. He visited Renata twice a year and called her every day. He had his mother's talent for the comment that could not quite be proven hostile. I had never fully trusted him. I had never imagined he was capable of this. Marcus and Clara had been married for 3 years when Renata began making noise about the house. Gerald's house, our house, the house Marcus grew up in, the house in Canada where I still live had been left to Marcus in Gerald's will, with the provision that I could remain there for my lifetime. It was not a complicated arrangement. Gerald had been a thoughtful man and a good lawyer, and he had written it carefully. Renata had never accepted it. She had been contesting it in small ways for 8 years, a letter from her own lawyer every 18 months or so, a phone call to Marcus that left him quiet and tired for days afterward. But in the past year, something had shifted. The letters became more frequent. There was talk of a codicil that Gerald had supposedly drafted, but never filed. There was an implication, never quite stated, that I had influenced Gerald in his final months when he was ill. Clara had been helping Marcus respond to the legal correspondence. She was precise and organized, and she understood documentation in the way that engineers do, and she had found several inconsistencies in Renata's claims that a lawyer later confirmed were significant. I believe that is why Renata told Daniel where Clara walked. I got Clara to my car. I had a first aid kit in the back. I am 67 years old. I have grandchildren. Of course I have a first aid kit. And I did what I could for the cuts on her hands and the gash above her ear while she sat in the passenger seat with her eyes closed. She had been walking the Riverside Trail at 7 in the morning, which she did 3 times a week, which Renata knew because Marcus had mentioned it at a family dinner 4 months ago. Daniel had been waiting near the second bridge. He'd said something first. Clara wouldn't tell me exactly what, but her face when she almost said it told me enough. Then he'd grabbed her by the coat and shoved her into the rocks at the side of the path. She had fought. Clara had grown up in northern Saskatchewan, and she was not a fragile person. She had gotten away. She had crawled to where Ruth found her, because Ruth walked that trail every morning with her dog, and Clara had known that, had held on to that fact while she was lying in the leaves, had believed that if she could just stay conscious long enough, Ruth would come. "Does Marcus know?" she asked me, while I was closing the first aid kit. "Not yet. He'll want to go find Daniel." "I know. You can't let him." "I know that too," I said. "That's why I'm calling my sister first." My sister Patricia is 64 years old, and for 31 of those years, she was a Crown attorney in Ontario. She prosecuted cases that other people said were too complicated, too political, too difficult to win. She had a reputation that made defense lawyers straighten their ties when they saw her name on the docket. She retired 2 years ago, but retirement for Patricia mostly means she now has more time to be formidable. She answered on the second ring. I told her what Clara had told me. There was a silence that I recognized. It was the silence Patricia makes when she is constructing something, when she is looking at a situation and seeing its architecture. Is Clara willing to speak to police today? Yes. Good. Don't let her shower or change clothes. Don't let her take anything for pain yet. I want her alert for the statement. Take her to the Ottawa hospital, not a walk-in clinic. We want this documented by an emergency physician. I'll meet you there in 40 minutes. Patricia, Eleanor, I know what you want to ask me. Yes, what he did is aggravated assault. Given the apparent motive and the planning involved, the fact that he knew her route, the fact that he was waiting, yes, there is a credible argument for attempted aggravated assault with intent to cause bodily harm. Depending on what Clara says in her statement, possibly more. I looked at Clara, sitting pale and straight in the passenger seat. And Renata? Another silence, different this time. That, Patricia said, is going to take a little more work. But Eleanor, you know I have never walked away from work. We spent 4 hours at the hospital. The emergency physician documented 7 distinct injuries, 3 cracked ribs, a fractured orbital bone around Clara's left eye, lacerations on both palms consistent with defensive wounds, bruising on her upper arms in the pattern of grip marks, and a concussion. The physician, a young woman who kept her voice steady and her face careful in the way that people do when they are managing their own anger professionally, photographed everything and wrote 4 pages of notes. 2 officers from Ottawa Police Service took Clara's statement in a private room while Patricia sat beside her. I sat in the waiting area and called Marcus. That conversation is not one I will describe in detail, because some things deserve privacy. What I will say is that my son arrived at the hospital in 22 minutes, which should not have been possible from where he works, and that when he came through the door and saw me, he looked like a man who had been broken and was trying to decide whether to fall. I held him in the corridor for a long time. She's all right, I kept saying. She's going to be all right. I knew something was wrong with Daniel, he said into my shoulder. I knew it and I didn't. Marcus, listen to me. You didn't do this. You are not responsible for what broken people choose to do. He pulled back and looked at me. He has Gerald's eyes, my late husband's eyes, that particular shade of gray that always looked like a sky about to clear. What do we do now? Now, I said. We let Patricia work. Patricia worked. In the days that followed, she moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that I had watched her bring to every difficult thing in her life since we were girls sharing a bedroom in Sudbury. She was not a lawyer on this case. Clara had retained her own counsel, an exceptionally sharp woman named Dominique, who specialized in assault cases. But Patricia knew every procedural corridor in the Ontario court system, and she knew which doors to knock on and how hard. Daniel was arrested at the Calgary airport 2 days after the assault, attempting to board a flight to Cancun with a carry-on bag that contained, among other things, $14,000 in cash. He had apparently believed that if he got out of the country quickly enough, the problem would resolve itself. He had apparently never met Patricia. The cash was interesting. Patricia had quietly suggested to Dominique that it was worth asking where a 28-year-old with no documented income had obtained $14,000 in a hurry. The answer, which emerged through a combination of bank records, subpoenaed as part of the criminal investigation, and some research that Patricia conducted with the focused energy of a woman who has been waiting patiently for justice for a very long time, was that the money had been transferred from an account in Renata's name 3 days before the assault. I will tell you what that means plainly. Renata had paid her son to hurt Clara. The criminal case against Daniel moved through the system the way these cases do, slowly, then suddenly. He had a lawyer, of course, who made the arguments that lawyers make. Daniel was troubled. Daniel had acted impulsively. Daniel had no prior criminal record and was remorseful and had a difficult childhood. Patricia and Dominique and Clara sat through all of it. At the sentencing hearing, which I attended with Marcus and his hand in mine, Dominique presented the victim impact statement that Clara had written herself, in her own precise and honest words, without drama and without minimizing. She described what it felt like to be lying on the ground in the cold leaves with broken ribs, waiting for a neighbor's dog to find her. She described calling Marcus's name in her head like a rhythm. She described what it had cost her the weeks of recovery, the way she still flinched at footsteps behind her on any path, the grief of learning that the people who were supposed to be her family had arranged this. The courtroom was very quiet when she finished reading. Daniel received 4 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge, in her remarks, used the word premeditated twice and the word cowardly once, which is not language judges typically deploy, and which told me something about what she had thought of the defense's arguments. Outside the courthouse, on the steps, with November in the air and the Parliament buildings visible in the distance, Clara stood beside Marcus and breathed. "Is it over?" she asked Patricia. "The criminal portion," Patricia said. "The civil portion is just beginning, and Renata still has her property claim." Clara looked at her. "Then we're not done." Patricia smiled, and it was the smile I had been watching her wear since we were children, the one that meant she had already thought of everything, had already mapped the road, had already decided where it ended. "No," she said, "we are absolutely not done." Renata's property claim had been moving through the courts for 2 years by the time the criminal case concluded. It had been, until the assault, a civil matter tedious, expensive, emotionally draining, but contained. What the investigation into Daniel's funding had revealed changed the shape of it considerably. Patricia had spent her career understanding how financial crimes worked alongside other crimes. She had a long conversation with a forensic accountant she'd worked with for years. They looked at the account the money had come from. They looked at other accounts connected to Renata. They found a pattern that was not, on its own, criminal, but that told a story about where money had gone over the years, about expenses that appeared in Renata's records that seemed difficult to explain, about a financial relationship between Renata and her lawyer that had certain unusual features. The Law Society of Ontario received a detailed complaint. Gerald's original estate lawyer, now retired in Prince Edward Island, received a call from Patricia that I imagine was not a comfortable conversation. The court handling the property claim received a motion from Marcus's legal team requesting a full disclosure of all documents related to the alleged codicil. The alleged codicil, it turned out, did not exist. What existed was a draft, a single draft, that Gerald's lawyer confirmed had been prepared at Renata's request and that Gerald had explicitly declined to sign. The document Renata had been presenting as evidence of her claim was a draft that had been altered after Gerald's death to remove the notation indicating it was unsigned. Document fraud. In a court proceeding, I sat with Patricia in her kitchen the evening she told me this, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not satisfaction, not victory, but something simpler. Something like the moment a long winter finally releases. "What happens now?" I asked. "She'll be referred to the Crown," Patricia said. "Whether they proceed is their decision. But the property claim is finished. It's over, Eleanor. The house is safe." I thought about Gerald, about the careful way he had loved Marcus, and the careful way he had written his will, and the 8 years Renata had spent trying to unpick it. "He would have liked Clara," I said. Patricia poured us each a glass of wine. "He would have loved her," she said. Spring came late that year, the way it sometimes does in Ottawa, holding back until you've almost given up, and then arriving all at once in a rush of green and warmth that makes you feel like the world is apologizing. I was in the garden on a Saturday morning in early May when I heard the gate. Marcus came through first, carrying a folding chair because he worries about me kneeling in the dirt for too long. Clara came behind him, and she was carrying my granddaughter. Isabel is 8 months old now. She has Marcus's gray eyes and Clara's particular way of looking at things, very focused, very intent, as though she is already taking notes. She had been born in February, in the middle of all of it, in the middle of hearings and statements and court dates, and her arrival had felt like the world insisting on itself, insisting that there were things that continued regardless. Clara set her down on the blanket I keep spread on the grass, and Isabel immediately grabbed a fistful of early clover and looked at it with grave scientific interest. "Patricia is coming for dinner," I said. "I know," she texted me. Clara sat down on the blanket beside Isabel. She moved without the careful guarding she'd had for months, without the way she used to hold herself as though something might still break. She said she has news about the Law Society. "Do you want to know it tonight?" Clara was quiet for a moment. She watched Isabel examine the clover. "Yes," she said, "but it's not the most important thing about tonight." I looked at her. "The most important thing about tonight," she said, "is that we're having dinner in your garden in the spring, and Isabel is eating a dandelion, and Marcus is going to pretend he didn't notice, and you're going to tell the story about the time Patricia cross-examined a witness so thoroughly that he apologized to the entire courtroom." I laughed. It came up from somewhere deep, the way laughing does when you have been serious for a very long time. Marcus, wrestling gently with Isabel over the dandelion, looked up at the sound of it. "What's funny?" "Everything," I said. "Eventually, everything. I am 67 years old, and I have learned that the people who try to take things from you, your home, your family, your sense of what is real and what you deserve, are counting on something. They are counting on you being tired. They are counting on you deciding that the fight costs more than the thing you're fighting for. They are counting on you being alone. They had not counted on Patricia. They had not counted on Clara, who had lain in the leaves by the creek and decided that Ruth would come and held on to that until she was right. They had not counted on Marcus, who had never for a single day of his adult life been the person his mother wanted him to be, which is to say, he had always been entirely, stubbornly, quietly himself. And they had not counted on me, an old woman with muddy knees and a first aid kit in her car and a sister who knew every door worth knocking on. Renata is facing fraud charges. Daniel is in federal prison in Alberta. The house in Canada is still mine, and on Sunday evenings my son calls me without fail, and sometimes now Clara calls first. The last time she called, Isabel was making sounds in the background, not words yet, but the shape of words, the reaching toward them. I sat in Gerald's chair by the window and listened to my granddaughter practice the beginning of language, and I thought, this is what they were trying to take. Not the house, not the money. This, they didn't get it.
"Stay in the car, Mrs. Whitmore. Please, don't come in until I call you." That was all my son's driver said to me. He'd rolled down the partition between the front seat and the back, turned just enough for me to see the side of his face, and said it quietly, the way you speak to someone when you're afraid of being overheard. I looked out the window. We were parked 2 houses down from my son's place. The street was a normal Tuesday morning in November. Bare maples, someone's recycling bin tipped over on the curb, a cat sitting on a porch railing. "Excuse me," I said. "Please, Mrs. Whitmore." He turned back to face the windshield. His hand stayed on the steering wheel even though the engine was off. "I'll explain. Just give me a few minutes." His name was Pete Dufour. He'd been driving for our family for going on 11 years, since back when my husband was still alive, and we needed someone reliable to get him to his medical appointments when I couldn't take the time off work. Pete had never once been dramatic. He showed up early, he kept the car clean, and he called ahead if he was going to be 2 minutes late. That was Pete. So when Pete Dufour told me to stay in the car in a voice that was trying very hard to stay level, I stayed in the car. I checked my watch. It was 9:40 in the morning. My son's engagement party, a brunch, small, just family and a few close friends, was supposed to start at 11. I'd asked Pete to take me over early to help set up. My son had told me that wasn't necessary, that his fiancée had it handled, but I'd insisted. I'd made my butter tarts the night before. They were in a tin on the seat beside me. I sat with my hands folded over that tin and I watched Pete's shoulders. He was watching the house. After maybe 4 minutes, I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard, a woman came out the front door. She wasn't my son's fiancée. I knew that immediately, not because I'd never seen her before, but because of everything about how she carried herself as she crossed the front porch. She wasn't looking around the way you do when you're leaving someone else's house. She moved like she owned the place. She had a key in her hand and she locked the door behind her.
Not the kind of fumble you do with a borrowed key, but the automatic pull check of someone who does it every day without thinking. She was carrying a child on her hip, a little boy, maybe 2.5. He had his face pressed into her neck. I watched her walk to the car parked at the curb, a dark blue Honda, put the child in the back seat, take her time doing up the straps, close the door, and drive away. I didn't move. Pete got out of the car. He came around to the rear passenger door and opened it, and he stood there with his hand on the doorframe, not quite looking at me. "How long?" I said. It wasn't a question really, but he answered it. "I've been driving him to her place on the Queensway for about 8 months," he said. I thought. I didn't know what it was at first, and then I did, and I didn't know what to do with that. He finally looked at me. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. I didn't know how to tell you." I looked at the house. The curtains in the front window were the ones I'd helped my son pick out 2 years ago. The blue linen ones from that shop on Bank Street, because he'd called me from the store and asked what I thought, and I'd said blue. Absolutely blue. "Does Heather know?" I said. He shook his head. Heather, my son's fiancée of 14 months. Heather, who'd had dinner at my house 6 times. Heather, who'd sent me a card when she found out about my knee surgery. Heather, who was planning to marry my son in March, who'd already put a deposit down on a venue in the Gatineau Hills, who'd shown me photos of table settings on her phone while I nodded and said, "Yes, that one, the eucalyptus. It's beautiful." "What's her name?" I said. "The woman." "I don't know her name," Pete said. "I only know the address." I sat there for another long moment. The butter tart tin was cold under my hands. "Take me home, Pete," I said. He nodded and closed the door. "I need you to understand something about me. I'm 63 years old. I taught high school English for 31 years. I have sat across from teenagers who looked me dead in the eye and told me they hadn't plagiarized an essay that I had watched them plagiarize in real time. I know what it looks like when someone has decided on a lie and committed to it completely. My son's name is Grady. He is 34 years old. He is the person I love most in the world. And I knew, sitting in that car with the butter tart tin in my lap, that I could not walk into that engagement party and pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. But I also knew I couldn't blow it up without knowing what I was dealing with, because that woman had a child, and that child had a father. And until I knew whether that father was my son, I was not going to do anything at all. Pete dropped me at home. I told him I wasn't feeling well, which was true enough. I put the butter tarts on the counter. I called my son and told him my knee was giving me trouble and I'd try to make it later. He said, "Mom, don't worry about it. Rest will save you some food." His voice was completely normal. That frightened me more than anything. I spent the next 3 days doing things I'd never imagined doing in my life. I'm a private person. I believe in minding my own business. But I also believe that your children's business becomes your business the moment their choices are about to hurt someone who doesn't deserve to be hurt. I drove to the Queensway address Pete had given me. I sat in my car. I drove myself. I wasn't going to involve Pete any further. And I watched. I felt ridiculous. I felt sick. I went back twice. The third time, I brought a coffee from Tim Hortons and told myself I was just a woman drinking coffee in her car, nothing to see here. I was there for maybe 40 minutes when my son's car turned onto the street. He parked. He got out. He went to the door and knocked, and it opened for him immediately, the way doors only open for people who are expected. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen. I looked at the butter tarts still on the counter, and I put them in the freezer because I couldn't look at them anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed in the dark, and I thought about my husband who died 4 years ago, who would have known what to do, or at least he would have sat up with me while we figured it out together, which amounts to the same thing. I thought about Grady as a little boy, 7 years old, bringing me a card he'd made at school for Mother's Day. Serious about it, the way he was serious about everything, wanting to make sure the spelling was right. I thought about Heather's face at the engagement dinner we'd had at the Whalesbone, how she'd laughed at something my husband's brother said and reached over and squeezed Grady's hand without thinking about it. The way you only touch someone when you've stopped being careful. I thought about that little boy asleep against his mother's neck. I called my cousin Sheila. Sheila is 70 and has been a paralegal for 40 years, and I trust her more than anyone alive. I didn't tell her why I was asking. I just asked her what a person would need, legally, to establish paternity. She walked me through it without prying, because that's who Sheila is. Then I called the number on the lease sign I'd written down outside the Queensway building. I told the property manager I was looking for information about a former tenant. I gave a false name. I'm not proud of that, and she told me more than she should have, because I spoke to her the way I speak to everyone, directly, calmly, as though I'm someone who has a right to be asking. The woman's name was Danny. She'd lived in that unit for 2 years. She was not, as far as the property manager knew, married. She had 1 child. I went back to the building one afternoon and I waited until she came out with the stroller. I introduced myself. I told her the truth, that I was Grady Whitmore's mother, and I thought she deserved to hear that directly from me. She stared at me for a long time. Then she sat down on the front step of the building, right there on the concrete, and she put her face in her hands. She wasn't a villain. That's the thing nobody wants you to say because it makes the story complicated. She was 29 years old, and she'd believed him when he said he was going to leave Heather, and she'd gone on believing it for long enough to stop asking. She thought the engagement had been called off. She hadn't known about the party. She hadn't known about March. Her son's name was Luca. He had Grady's eyebrows. I looked at that little boy in his stroller eating a cracker, and something shifted in my chest in a way I cannot entirely explain. It wasn't rage. I'd expected rage. It was something quieter and sadder, like grief. "Has he said anything recently?" I asked her. "About the future? About you?" She looked up at me. "He said we'd work it out after Christmas." I nodded. "What are you going to do?" she said. I didn't answer right away. I was watching Luca with his cracker. "I'm going to do what I should have done 3 weeks ago," I said. "I'm going to talk to my son. I want to be very precise about what happened next, because I've told this story a few times now and people always want to rewrite the ending into something neater than it was. I did not confront Grady at the engagement party. I did not make a scene. I did not call Heather before I talked to him. I called Grady and I told him to come to my house that evening. I told him it wasn't optional. He knew the moment he walked in. I could see it. He sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework for 12 years, where he'd eaten approximately 1,000 bowls of cereal, where he'd told me he'd gotten into university, where we'd sat together the day after his father's funeral and barely spoken, and he looked at his hands. I put a cup of tea in front of him. I sat down across from him. "Tell me about Danny," I said. He was quiet for a long time. What followed was the hardest conversation I have ever had with my son. Harder than when he was 16 and I found out he'd been drinking. Harder than when his father died and we had to talk about what that meant for the family business. Harder than anything. He didn't lie. I'll give him that. Once I'd said the name, once he understood I already knew, he stopped trying to manage the situation and he just told me. All of it. That it had started as something he thought would end on its own. That it had gone on too long and he hadn't known how to stop. That when Danny told him she was pregnant, he panicked, and the panic had turned into a kind of paralysis. And the paralysis had turned into 14 months of leading 2 lives. He cried. I haven't seen my son cry since his father's funeral. I didn't comfort him. I want you to know that. Not because I don't love him. I love him more than I know how to say, but because he was not the one who needed comforting right now. Heather was. Danny was. Luca, who would grow up with a father who had spent the first years of his life treating him like a secret, was. When he was done, I slid a piece of paper across the table. It had Sheila's number on it. "You're going to call Heather tonight," I said, "and then you're going to call a lawyer tomorrow. Sheila can refer you to a family lawyer she trusts. You're going to do this properly, and you're going to do it before the weekend." He looked at the piece of paper. "Mom."
I met Luca, I said. He went very still. He's going to know his father, I said. And his father is going to be someone he can respect. That starts right now, tonight. Do you understand me? Grady called Heather that night. I don't know exactly what he said, but she called me the following morning. I answered. She cried. I let her. I didn't try to explain or excuse. I said I was sorry. I said she deserved so much better. I said she was going to be fine, and I meant it. Not as something you say, but as something I genuinely believed, because Heather is one of the strongest women I've ever met, and she was going to be fine, even if fine was still a long time away. She asked me how long I'd known. I told her the truth. 3 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" It's a fair question. I'd sat with it a lot. I didn't tell her sooner because I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I blew up her life. I needed to know if there was any version of this I'd misunderstood. I didn't want to be the mother-in-law who caused chaos based on a morning's worth of information. But I also, and this is harder to say, I was hoping I was wrong. I was hoping there was an explanation. I'd given my son 3 weeks of benefit of the doubt he did not deserve. I told her that. All of it. Another long silence. Then she said, "I guess that's what mothers do." There was no warmth in it, but there was no cruelty either. It was just a fact. And she was right. The engagement party venue deposit was non-refundable, $5,200. Heather lost it. The florist had a cancellation policy that took another $800. I don't know the full accounting, and it's not my place to know, but I know those numbers because Grady told me, guilty, like he was confessing to something additional. He paid it all back to her. That was the first right thing he did. Grady and Danny are not together. I want to be clear about that because people always assume the story ends with the man running off to the other family, and that's not what happened. What happened is that 2 people who had hurt each other in complicated ways decided to try to be adults about a child who had done nothing wrong. They have a schedule. Luca stays at Grady's apartment Wednesday nights and every other weekend. It is not a perfect arrangement. Nothing about this is perfect. Grady is in therapy. I made that a condition of my continued support, which is not something I'd expected to have to do at 63, but here we are. People ask me sometimes whether I'm angry, whether I'm embarrassed, whether I've forgiven him. I'm his mother. Forgiveness isn't really a door I can close, and I've stopped pretending it is, but I also don't think forgiveness means you stop seeing clearly. I see my son clearly now in a way I didn't before this happened. His capacity for avoidance, his instinct to let things continue rather than do the hard thing early. Those are things I love him enough to name. Last October, I had Danny and Luca over for Sunday dinner. Just the 3 of us. I made roast chicken and that potato gratin I've been making since 1987. Luca sat in the booster seat I borrowed from my neighbor and ate approximately 4 potatoes and seemed very pleased about this. After dinner, while Danny was in the bathroom, Luca climbed down from his chair and came over and leaned against my leg. Just leaned there, looking at the table. Not asking for anything. Just there. I put my hand on his back. Felt the little ribs, the warmth through his shirt. I thought about Grady at that age. How small he'd been, how much I'd worried about everything. I thought about how much I still don't know, how long the rest of this will take, how many conversations are still ahead. But right then, with that little boy leaning against my leg in my kitchen on a Sunday evening, what I felt more than anything was something that didn't have a clean name. Not happiness exactly, not peace, something more like, this is real, this is the actual life. Not the one I planned, not the one I would have chosen, the real one, with all its mess and its grief and its small stubborn graces. We carry on. That's what we do. We carry on. And to anyone listening to this story, if you're sitting with something you know and don't know what to do with, something that feels too heavy to carry alone and too fragile to put down, I just want to say this. You don't have to have the whole plan before you take the first step.
Sometimes the first step is just sitting still long enough to see what's actually in front of you, and then you move. One thing at a time. With as much honesty as you can manage, that's all any of us can do. I've thought a lot about what I would have done differently. It's a question I keep coming back to, the way you press on a bruise without meaning to. If Pete hadn't told me to stay in the car that morning, if I just walked up to Grady's door with my butter tarts and my good intentions, I don't know what I would have seen, or whether I'd have understood what I was looking at. Maybe nothing. Maybe I would have gone inside and arranged food on trays and gone home and never known. And the wedding would have happened. March in the Gatineau Hills, eucalyptus on the tables. And somewhere across town, a little boy named Luca would have grown up wondering why his father kept making promises he couldn't keep. I don't think the universe arranged things. I don't believe in that. Not exactly. But I do believe that the truth has a way of pressing toward the surface when it's been buried long enough. Pete had been carrying what he knew for 8 months. That's a long time to carry something alone, and when he finally couldn't carry it anymore, he did the only thing he could think of. He let me see it myself, because he knew I'd need to. That's what I mean when I talk about integrity. Not the grand version of it, not the kind you announce, the quiet kind. The kind that costs you something. Pete risked his job that morning. He risked our whole relationship. He had no way of knowing how I'd react, whether I'd be the kind of woman who would shoot the messenger and protect the comfortable story. He trusted that I wasn't. I've tried every day since to be worthy of that. And Grady, my son, who I love and who disappointed me in ways I'm still sorting through. I used to think that the opposite of good character was malice, that people did harmful things because they wanted to hurt someone. What I understand now is that most harm comes from avoidance, from the decision, made quietly and repeatedly, to not do the hard thing today. Grady didn't set out to deceive anyone. He set out to avoid a difficult conversation, and then another one, and then another, until the avoidance had built a structure so complicated he couldn't see the way out. That's not malice. It's a failure of courage, which is in some ways worse, because courage is something you can actually practice. You can choose it every day in small ways until it becomes the thing you reach for first instead of last. Heather will be fine. I knew it when I heard her voice on the phone that morning, even through the tears. There's a particular kind of strength that comes from surviving something you didn't expect to survive, and she has it now. That's not a small thing. And Luca, that little boy, leaning against my leg in my kitchen on a Sunday evening, warm and completely unbothered, eating potato gratin and asking for more. He didn't choose any of this. None of what happened was his doing, and none of the consequences were fair to him. But he is here, he is real, and the people around him are, slowly and imperfectly, trying to do right by him. That's what I'd tell anyone sitting with something heavy right now. Not that it works out, not that everything happens for a reason, just that the truth, however hard, is always a better foundation than the comfortable lie. You can build something real on honesty. You cannot build anything lasting on avoidance. We carry on, one honest step at a time.